How do we look? Good, okay, well, in the late 20th century, pop psychology decided to make some broad sweeping assumptions about the nature of the brain. And there's the left brain and the right brain. Well, some early studies had indicated that the seat of verbal processing was on the side of the brain opposite the strongest hand of a person. So in right-handed people, the left side of the brain was considered to be the verbal part, while the right side of the brain was this sort of mystery of supposedly intuitive knowledge. Well, as the 21st century arose and technology advanced to the point where you could have in vivo imagery of the actual activity in the brain, well, it turned out that some of those assumptions are really turned on their head. For instance, once the Dalai Lama allowed cajoled a few of his monks to go to Minnesota and have their brainwaves tested while they put themselves into various higher states of consciousness, it was discovered that, contrary to expectations, it was the verbal, or the left side of the brain, that showed tremendous amounts of activity while the right side of the brain was quiet. What are the implications of this? Well, as they looked deeper into what kind of activities stimulated the left and the right brain, they discovered that the left side was the side where patterns, where learned behavior was stored, and the ability of the brain to fire large amounts of neurons tended to reside in that hemisphere, because that hemisphere has an integrated physiological structure where many neurons are connected to each other, and when they fire, you can fire a whole net of them. And when somebody is in an extremely high state of consciousness, a lot of those neurons get fired at one point. Well, interestingly enough, they've also discovered that people who are experiencing great pleasure, or people who are in generally good feeling, good emotional states, good affective states, are also firing a lot, not in this kind of dark mass intuitive side of the brain, but in the part of the brain where there are patterns. Patterns provide comfort. It also turns out that children operate more on the right side. That is, they operate more on the intuitive side. And over the course of life, more and more mental functioning gravitates from the right or unstructured side to the left or structured side. Again, this sort of puts on its head the 20th century pop psychology that we want to be in our intuitive selves. Actually, intuitive was the wrong word. It was the wrong concept. The concept is unstructured, taking in new information. And the body, the brain, is physiological hardwired that new information is painful while patterns are pleasurable. It turns out that this left-right dichotomy in structure is not only in the prefrontal cortex, which is pretty much unique to humans and a few other higher mammals, but actually operates right down to the level of the amygdala. There's a left and a right side to the amygdala, and they too have that kind of processing. So, and that kind of lifetime progression. So you'll see the same sort of integration of patterns into behavior in reptiles that you will reflected in the higher humans. We were talking about the origin of thought and the origin of silence, really. And I've thought about this as well, because the whole concept of neural nets and the concept of neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the mind to affect the brain, the mind being the thoughts that you're experiencing or the feelings that you're experiencing, while the brain being the underlying physical structure. There's a relationship there. It's not necessarily an entirely linear relationship, but it appears apparent that it is possible to use the mind, whatever the mind is, to change the physiological structure of the brain. Now, for people who are suffering from various kinds of affective disorders, this says that it's actually possible to move some of that processing, some of the physiological firing from the side of the brain that's experiencing pain to the side of the brain that actually experiences pleasure as a natural part of its architecture. I've thought about this concept of where does a thought start, because a thought very often involves the firing of many neurons, but the imagery shows that you actually start by firing a few neurons. And, well, maybe what you're really firing is one neuron that stimulates a couple of neurons that then stimulates the activity of an entire net. The question is, where in that neuron does that first molecule move that moves that neuron to the point where it actually fires, that then drives off into this whole firing of a neural net? And then when you start to think, well, maybe all we have to do is move one molecule or one portion of a molecule in order to actually start a thought. Well, maybe that's a subtle enough movement that this mind can actually move something in the physical world. You're not moving a whole boulder uphill. All you're doing is moving some very subtle electrical state. You're moving the, who knows how subtle it needs to be in order to set off the chain of events that has a thought go. So the question is, where am I in this? Who am I in this? Am I the kind of the resulting thought that comes out, or am I this force that moves the portion of an atom or a molecule that then sets off an entire neural net that then generates the thoughts and the feelings that I'm having at the present time? Indeed, where's this rap that I'm giving coming from? I've got these, I've read a few books this year, I've got some ideas in my mind, I've got some concepts, yet at some point there's some one thing moving that's driving the whole chain. That is worthy of exploration.